This is the oldest floating lightship in the country right now, and this ship has a wonderful past. She served the country since 1904 as a sentinel of the sea, and there isn't another one like it. So it's important as a historical landmark, and it's also important to the future generations of our children so that they can come on board and see what life at sea was like 100 years ago.
This is 8 years older than Titanic and still here with us floating today, and it's a major cornerstone of maritime history here in the Northwest. Obviously, our long-term goal is to restore the ship and have it available here as a floating museum. But the journey getting there is what we really want to focus on. Using the restoration project to teach and let people get their hands on some tools and to directly connect with their heritage.
A lightship is something that we put, but we can't build a lighthouse. There's no land there or anything, but we want it there, and so we anchor a lighthouse is what we do. Lighthouses let us guide ships at night, and they were very important until the development of GPS, LORAN, radar, and all this stuff. The first lighthouse was in Egypt before the time of Christ, and ever since then, people have been building lighthouses. Lots of times it was just a big fire on the top of a cliff. In the United States, the 9th law ever passed by Congress was for the lighthouse service, so we could build lighthouses. And lightships, they were necessary because we had a place like at the mouth of the Straits of Juan de Fuca here where there was no place to build a lighthouse. So we anchored a lightship, and that's just a floating lighthouse.
Lightship 83 was built in Camden, New Jersey in 1904. This was preceded the building of the Panama Canal, so they brought these two ships, the 83 and her sister ship, around Cape Horn in South America, and they took turns actually towing each other to save on fuel.
This ship came out here under steam and sail combination and took up station on the west coast and operated first off the California coast, Blunt's Reef, for 30 years, and then moved to San Francisco. It was the San Francisco lightship up until World War II, when it was actually pulled off station, put a deck gun on it, anti-aircraft guns, and became a naval vessel. Returned to lightship duty after the war, came north and became the relief ship for the 3 northern stations, including the Swiftsure Bank. This was the turning mark for ships coming into Puget Sound. The entire economy that built the Pacific Northwest was shipping, and those ships all relied on this vessel to be on station outside the entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca for guidance into the harbor. Its basic function is to be an offshore floating lighthouse. So it has a light at the top of that second mast there. It blinks just like a lighthouse, has a special pattern that signals that this is a particular station. And in the early days, the beacon lights used to be a chandelier of oil lanterns that you would hoist up and down the mast. They would slide down these tracks you can sort of see on the other mast down there, and they'd come down to the house, and the roof of the house would actually open up. And the whole thing would descend into the house and then close the roof and then have a sheltered place to oil all the lanterns and trim the wicks and clean the lenses and everything. And it actually also has a foghorn, which is that 4-trumpeted thing coming out behind the first mast there, which can be heard at 5 miles, a huge loud foghorn. The wheelhouse used to come to right about here was the front of the wheelhouse, and it was up half a deck, so the hub of the wheel would have been right about here. And then mounted right in front of it, right about where this paint ladder is now, is a 1,000-pound fog bell. If the fog whistle stopped working, this is your backup system. All too often the crew had to get a mallet and walk out there and ring the bell by hand. 2, 3. It's absolutely deafening. The crew all dreaded having to use it. Well, let's head down below and see where actually most of the ship is still intact down here. So this is one of the critical spaces of a lightship. As an anchored floating beacon, its 2 most important things are the light and the anchor. The anchor was rigged on these chains and it could be raised or lowered with this hide windlass. Because this ship is anchoring in the open ocean with the jerking of riding up and over waves and pulling on the chain, you need a really powerful steam windlass to bring that up. In rough weather, this is a scary place to be because every time the ship rises up on a wave, it yanks that anchor chain tight, and all this gear makes a horrible banging and slamming. And there'd be water surging up around the chain and up into the forepeaks. So in rough weather, this was a pretty terrifying spot in here. Certainly noisy. Right behind the windlass room, we have the main crew quarters. This is a crew's mess. They had their table set up here. This is where they hung out all the time. Their cabins are arranged around here with 3 bunks per cabin on both sides. This is also where the galley is, so there's a huge cast iron stove in here burning diesel fuel. This is where the chief steward would be working. So most of the crew spent their downtime in this space. It's a rough place to be because you're directly below the foghorn, but it is close to the coffee and the food, so that's really what matters to the crew. And then all the way at the stern of the ship we have the officers' quarters with this lovely paneling. All this is 1904 original stuff, all carefully carved moldings. This was really a very elegant quarters, a very Edwardian interior. Here you got 1 huge bunk for each guy. He's got 4 big drawers, a whole closet. He's got a sink in his cabin. It's pretty cushy living. This is my favorite cabin of them all, because this is the only one that really tells you who lived here. I'll give you the standard challenge I give everyone. Can you tell whose cabin this was?
I'm gonna have to guess the chief engineer's.
Bullseye. This guy didn't even have to get out of his bunk, and he could tell what was happening in the engine room down below. So right here we're seeing just the top of an engine that's 2 stories tall. Now we're down to the level where the engine room crew actually worked. The engineer would be here with his oilers and wipers, and they would be wiping up excess oil and running around with the little oil cans and oiling up everything on the engine. Come in here, you'll see this is where the engineer's station. He had an engine telegraph that gave him orders from the wheelhouse. He'd receive his orders, change the speed of the engine, change the direction of the engine, and then all these pistons would be going up and down, hissing, and it'd be piping hot down here. When the ship was coal-fired, he had a crew here with a shovel, and this was a solid bulkhead, and he could pull open a door and coal would dump onto the deck plate, and he would be loaded up, chuck it into the boiler, and get it burning. And fixing stuff on this ship was not going to be easy because everything is heavy, and we've really learned that in the restoration. So heavy metalworking was a big piece of it, sharpening your own tools. These are just the little wrenches on the wrench rack, and some of these are pretty hefty devices. So needed a bit of muscle to work on this ship. Tough guys who were out there in wild weather, riding out those storms, making sure everybody else was going to be safe and get to harbor. It's impressive that those guys were out there in that weather all the time, on station. Talk about diligence. That's what these ships were all about. This is the legacy we're trying to preserve here in the process of rebuilding and preserving the ship.
The long-term goal, of course, is to complete the restoration and have the ship pretty much as she was when lightships protected our coasts. Fortunately, we have obtained over $1 million in grants to date for this restoration project, and so as long as we have money, we're in a position to continue along.
The boat just came out of the boatyard with a tremendous amount of work done to it, and now with apprentices and volunteers, we're laying a whole new Douglas fir timber deck on it. And it's been a real interesting learning experience, having to back up and figure out what people did 100 years ago. There's so many skill sets that are used in putting this ship back together that are not being taught, that are being lost. And there's a lot of young people who want those skills.
Northwest Seaport has established relationships with several schools, the Seattle Central College's Wood Technology Center, Seattle Maritime Academy, and Ballard High School's Marine program have all been through here. I am trying to get as involved with the Swiftsure as possible with my students because it is a fabulous learning tool for what we do.
One of our plans for this ship is to make the Lightship into a maritime career center. We intend to have classes aboard the ship to teach people maritime skills. So not only does this ship have a wonderful past, but we hope that it's going to be useful in aiding people to get involved in the maritime industry in the future.
Seattle has always been dependent on its maritime industry, but there aren't as many young people coming into the industry as there used to be, and we really need in the industry more young people. And that's where Swiftsure comes in, is she can be a platform for both exposing people to the industry and providing some of the basic training. And so by investing in the Swiftsure and investing in the restoration, we're really making an investment that will ensure the vitality of our maritime economy, which in turn supports Seattle and the region as a whole.
It's important that these lightships are being restored because they don't exist anymore. In about 1983, the last one went out of service. The last lightship went out of service. So this is worth doing, even if it just teaches people that they did exist at one time.
Seattle wouldn't be Seattle without the waterfront and its maritime history and that industry. And this was a very important part of it because you couldn't really sustain shipping up and down the west coast that really built this part of the country without making passage safe and reasonable, and that's one of the roles that this lightship had. And just to be able to walk onto a piece of history and to see that piece of history the way it was, to experience it, to imagine what it was like to live and work on it, I think is going to be a lot of fun for visitors and very educational as well.